Touch your neighbor, say, I'm so glad I came to church today. Thank you. This is one of those weeks where I feel kind of like we could just, as it says in Matthew, just sing a hymn and go out. Yeah. Amen. I'm not going to do that, but I'm saying. But I feel like if it did, wouldn't nobody get mad? Amen. Turn with me to the 41st chapter of the book of Genesis. I trust you can find Genesis quickly. Beginning with the 46th verse. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, quote, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household," unquote. The second son he named Ephraim and said, quote, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering," unquote. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began. Just as Joseph had said, there was famine in all other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. But the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the world. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there, buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. The scripture as it is written, and may the Lord add a blessing to the reading and the hearing of his most holy word. You may be seated in the presence of the Lord and each other. And as you take your seat, turn towards at least somebody around you and say to them, "Wakanda forever, baby." Wakanda forever, baby. Today we continue in this sermon series entitled "The Gospel Comes to Wakanda," taking advantage of the popularity, even the preoccupation with this new action character movie called Black Panther. And This week is the third installment of said movie. In the first week, I said all great movies are known in part for great lines that are spoken in the movie, such as in A Few Good Men, where you had a gnarly, grumpy, angry Jack Nicholson playing the role of a colonel who says to a young and flippant Navy lawyer, "You can't handle the truth." Last week we said that all great movies are known for their subplots. All of the little spin-off narratives, or should I say narratives that spin off from the movie's main storyline, fleshing out all of the various characters in the movie, and thereby giving the movie depth and multi-dimension, and creating portholes through those characters and their stories for the viewing audience to find themselves in the story as we relate to the circumstances of the various characters. A movie, a story can't bless you until you find yourself in the story. This week, let me begin by saying that all great movies are great in large part because the main storyline, somehow or another, speaks to the salient issues of the day for the viewing audience. Somehow the movie is relevant to the big issues that those who have paid their fare, paid their admission, bought their popcorn, settled into their seats, and now are viewing this movie that might be time, date stamped thousands of years ago in a culture removed from their own, yet somehow or another it sneaks up on you, expected or unexpected, that the movie is very much on point with the very issues that the viewing audience themselves are struggling with, and thereby its greatness in large part is that it is relevant to the creative tension, the issues that are hanging yet unresolved in our own lives. In the movie Black Panther, the main storyline is clear. There is an ancient, or there is a fictional African nation named Wakanda, that in ancient of times a meteor sped to earth and plunged into its mountains the near magical material called vibranium that provides them with a technological advantage over all other peoples of the earth. It enables them to make technological advances, medical breakthroughs, even discovering ways to unleash the body's powers of regeneration, advancing it beyond what any society on the earth has ever or could ever, apart from access to such material, ever do. They are hidden behind impenetrable rainforest and appear to the outside world as no more than another third world poor African nation featuring shepherds and peasants. And yet on the inside it is hiding the most sophisticated society the world has ever seen. Over the years, though, they have been content internally to simply enjoy an advanced society themselves, keeping the secret all to themselves, fearing if word got out, they might be subject to the invasions of other peoples who want the vibranium to take it for themselves, for their own noble or nefarious purposes. And so they've become an isolated, insular, private, provincial nation of occupants of what, for all intent and purposes, by default to design, has become a private promised land. But over the years, the tension has risen from within and without for them to reconsider their role in the world. There are some who, for ignoble reasons, for nefarious reasons, want to access the vibranium. People like the Swiss physicist Ulysses Klaus, who wants to get the vibranium so that he, on the open market, can sell it to others and enrich himself by selling to people who want to make weapons by which they can annihilate others. There are people like Eric Kilgore, who himself has Wakandi's blood in his veins, but the abandoned child who grew up in Oakland, according to the movie, different from the comic book series, who, driven by the anger of his abandonment and his father's death that he didn't really understand, he wants to get the vibranium and use it, so he says, to liberate suffering, oppressed black people all over the globe. That sounds good, but his end is no good. Because he didn't seek as an end a world of justice and racial reconciliation, where we reconstitute the nation and the world on a broader base of liberty and freedom and justice for all. But he simply wants to replace white supremacy and white domination of all non-white people with black supremacy and black domination of all non-black people. And as Martin King once said, a doctrine of black supremacy is just as dangerous and evil as is a doctrine of white supremacy. Because neither are rooted in a sense of equality and justice. It's just a matter of who's going to be dominated and who's going to be dominator, both of which are evil. But then there are forces from within the nation, like Wakabu, who wants revenge for his father's death at the hands of Ulysses Klaus. But at the same time, he fears foreigners. He's xenophobic. He says if you allow in foreigners and outsiders, they will bring their problems. Maybe they are rapists and murderers, drug dealers. It's the xenophobic exaggerations of other people to justify a policy of isolation and protectionism. But then there is even the opinion of Nakia, the love of the life of King T'Challa, who is played by the lovely Lupita Nyong'o. Ooh, say it again, Lupita Nyong'o. I knew there were some hyenas in up in here. And she stays away from home because she has an inward compulsion to go out and serve the world that is burning and fighting and starving and suffering the world over. Not just black people, but all over the world is broken and fragmented in ways that can, at least in part, be resolved by the secrets that are known by the people of Wakanda, if they were willing in some ways to share what they have with the world. And so the tension in the movie is, what kind of nation is Wakanda going to be? Is it going to be a private, isolated, protectionist, internal, provincial, private promised land for privileged, entitled residents and occupants who seek as a goal only to hold on to their privileges and advantages and entitlements at all cost? Or are they going to be a progressive partner in a global village who have some sense of, we have an obligation not just for ourselves, but for our fellow man and woman who may live not only from within but beyond our shores? That is the tension And the movie ends with King T'Challa standing before the United Nations saying we must find a way to take care of one another. And some flippant member of the United Nations say, what possibly can a poor third world African nation have to offer the world? He's really saying, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And with the unspoken smirk on his face, you can almost hear him saying like Jesus, come and see. That's the next movie. But the question of what kind of nation you're going to be when you are the top dog, when you are the superpower, when you are the mightiest in financial resources, in GDP, in military might, in land mass, in intellectual resources, when you are the world power, the question becomes, what kind of nation are you going to be? Are you going to live unto yourself and let the rest of the world burn, or is there going to be a dividend for what God has done for you? If the mentality, we're blessed to be a blessing. That's the tension of every nation. What kind, now that they have it all and are the envy of the world, what kind of nation are you going to be with all that God has placed in your hand? That's the tension in ancient Egypt, where we find this story of an other Black Panther, a man named Joseph. Yo, you didn't know Joseph was a Black Panther? Black, yes. His people, his father and 11 brothers, they're over in Canaan now, where they have settled. And you know, Canaan is the name of the nation. It's named after the progenitor Canaan, who was the grandson of Noah, who had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, who in the etiology of the Yahwist writings of Scripture represent the 3 slices of the human pie, ethnically speaking, and Ham, used interchangeably with Cush, represents the black-skinned people of the earth. Ham's son is Canaan, Noah's grandson. Canaan is simply synonym for black people. His folk are over there in Canaan with them black people. He's from the hood. He's from the block. He's black. It's in the text. But also the panther, which represented the access to these enhanced powers of body and mind, special powers. You didn't see that Joseph had special powers. Joseph had special powers that showed up when he was a little boy. When he was blessed by God with what they called the gift of the Onar. It was a gift that only God given. It was a God-given endowment that allowed him to become what they called a seer. He could see into the not yet as if it were the now, and foresee coming events so that he could foretell and prepare oneself accordingly. And it was that gift from the gods, those special powers, that caused him to be the envy of his jealous brothers, who then conceived a plot to kill him, modified just to sell him into slavery, because they didn't want blood guilt on their hands. So they said, here this dreamer, this Black Panther comes with those superpowers. Let us slay him, cast him into some pit, and then let's see what becomes of his dreams. They found out, like Killmonger and them found out, it's hard to get rid of a Black Panther. Even if you throw him off a cliff, he may be found in a riverbed and held by your enemy till somebody can get him later and get the serum from the heart-shaped flower to bring him back. It's hard to get rid of a Black Panther. This Black Panther was cast in a pit, sold off into slavery, thought they was through with him. In the providence of God, he landed in the house as a slave to a man named Potiphar, who noticed his superpowers, put him in charge of everything. Everything that touched his hand prospered. He said, you can have everything in my house except the missus. But the missus was of a different mindset. She didn't graduate from WSU, but she was a cougar. Yes. husband stayed gone too long, wasn't around to scratch an itch. And this text says that Joseph was a goodly young man. That was that King Jamesian 16th century English for saying a man who had a barrel chest, but a tight waist and thunder thighs and a firm jaw with a long chin, high cheekbones, blackish brownish skin, a 360-point wave with his hair with a little pomade on it, deep voice, but could hit some high falsetto notes when singing love songs. Walking around shirtless with the sun beaming on, enough sweat to make it glisten, and that cougar went crazy, and the cougar attacked the panther. Thanks be to God, a panther is a little bit faster than a cougar, and he got out before the cougar could get her hands on the panther. But it was a culture where when an Egyptian girl cried, then a Hebrew boy died. And so he ended up at 17 years old in the sunken place. He ended up in prison 13 years on trumped up charges because of a lying behind cougar. Tingling her little glass got him in the sunken place. He didn't see the movie, or he'd have ran soon as he saw her. So he ended up in the sunken place until the same superpowers that caused him to be the object of the envy of his trifling brothers caused him to get on the radar of the Pharaoh, whose spirit was being upset by a series of haunting dreams. Kept having this dream of fat cows that were grazing, going along fine, and then skinny cows coming up eating fat cows. That don't make no sense. How a skinny cow gonna eat a fat cow? And I could see a fat cow eating a skinny cow. But a skinny cow eating a fat cow didn't make no sense. And every night he had the same dream, skinny cows eating fat cows. And he went to all the wise men of Egypt to see if they could interpret the dream, but they had regular powers. They didn't have no superpowers. And so somebody said, listen, there's a cat, literally a panther, and named Joe. This dude has some special powers. He can see stuff before it happened. And I bet if you call on Joe, Joe can come and interpret, just short for Joseph. He can come and interpret your dreams. The king said, where is he? He's in the sunken place. So they went down into jail, got him from the sunken place and brought him before Pharaoh, told him the dream. He said, oh, I know what that is. The superpowers started kicking in. And he told the king, he says, it's going to be 7 years of plenty. Stock market's going to be up. Unemployment's going to be down. GDP's going to expand. And he said, during those years, don't do no crazy tax cut and blow up debt when the economy's already moving. And put you back in deficit. Don't work against the economy. But during this time, just let the economy roll on and save. Store up everything you can store up, because after these 7 years, 7 years of famine is coming, and the only thing you're going to have to survive on is what you stored up in the 7 years of plenty. The king was grateful for the superpowers deserved, that a brother like that didn't deserve to, with those kind of powers, didn't need to be in no sunken place. They need to be in his place. See, this was a king who appreciated having talented people around him. He wasn't afraid of people with powers. He wasn't looking for the D-League, who would simply be ideologues and hype buddies to approve and affirm your ignorance. But people who got enough powers to say, I see some trouble coming unless. So he elevated him to the position of the equivalent of the Secretary of Agriculture / Deputy Pharaoh, and he became the second most powerful man in the world. And then the Pharaoh, and I like him because he realizes a man can't have a one-dimensional life. He can't be all work and no play. Makes Jack a dull boy and Jill a dull girl. And so he also blessed him with a wife named Asenath, who Asenath meant daughter of Neith. Neith was the Egyptian goddess of beauty and sensuality. In other words, he gave that Black Panther some bubbling black sugar named Nakia. Say it again, say it again. And right in the middle of the Yahwist writer narrating on the socio-geopolitical issues, he stops almost as if he can't help himself to let you know what was going on with the panther personally. He says that while he was in Egypt, he and Asenath had 2 sons whose names reflected his perception of his experience in Egypt. The oldest boy's name was Manasseh, which meant forgetting about my father's house, because it was in his father's house where his 10 of his 11 trifling brothers, excluding the baby boy Benjamin, who had the same mama as him, but his other half brothers from the 3 other mothers that his father Jacob had in that polygamous society, tried to kill him. They were trifling, they were cutthroat, they was low down. And he says that while in Egypt, he's forgot about them. Why? Because the love of Asenath melted away all the trauma that he had experienced from being sold into slavery and doing hard time in the sunken place because of that Egyptian girl. That the loving of this one woman knocked that angry edge off his shoulder. He went from mad at the world to just chilling. I ain't mad at you. I'm telling you, every brother out there with an attitude may be one good love away from just being cool with everybody. I'm telling you, I'm just saying. And then the second child, Ephraim, meant I have prospered in the land of my suffering. In the same place where I did 13 years on trumped up charges, I, in spite of all that, have ascended to being the second most powerful man in the world, with the complete confidence of the Pharaoh, who's not insecure about having talented people with powers around him. I've prospered in the place of my pain. And then after explaining that, he goes right back into talking about that after this now, after the 7 years of plenty, it says Joseph went out and he stored up everything. He stored them in the temple granaries first, and then he stored up in the cities where they made the grain. Joseph does something revolutionary. You don't see it in the text. Joseph, being a Hebrew, while he's the second most powerful man in Egypt, he's not Egyptian. And what he brings to the throne, in addition to his superpowers, is a different ethic undergirded by a different faith and a different worldview that causes him to carry out his superpowers from a different ethical vantage point. See, previously, there was grain in the temple granaries, but they were only partially full. Only a fraction of their capacity was met with the amount of grain in the temple granaries, Vanya, because the grain in the temple granaries was not for the folk. It was for ceremonial purposes, as the grain was used to appease the gods of Egypt. You see, they were a polytheistic people, poly meaning many, theistic God. Their belief was that there were many gods, that the cosmos, the heavens and the earth, was ruled by a committee of gods. Not uncommon in that part of the world. They were pagans. They had graven images of the things that they believed were God, and they were polytheistic. And part of their polytheistic faith said that the gods who are angry need to be appeased. And so we appease them by feeding them of the abundance of the land. The gods need to be fed with the abundance of the land, even while the people starve. And so the grain was grown in the towns, out in the local communities. It was then shipped by wagon into the cities where the elite and the kings and the priests lived, and put enough in the granaries where they appeased the gods through ceremony. And so the gods needed to be fed, but because these gods were not real gods, they had mouths but could not eat. The grain either rotted, or the priests and the elite came through the back door and took the grain so that the grain did not waste. It's similar to what is talked about in the New Testament. We're talking about meat given to idols. They would feed the idols meat, but since there were gods with no teeth who could not eat, the meat would rot. So folks would come after the ceremony and take them lamb chops and pork chops and New York cut and ribeye home, because ain't no sense in letting good meat go to waste. And so here it was grain. The poor folks grew it in the countrysides. It was shipped by wagon to the city and used in ceremonies to appease the gods that had a need to be fed off the abundance of the land while the people starved. And then, since they had mouths but could not eat, the priests and the elite came out the back door and took the grain. So you systematically redistributed wealth upward. So the rich, literally, who are already overfed, were getting richer, and the poor couldn't even eat the grain they grew and were starving in a land of food production. Poverty is always a social construct. It has to do with sinful systems of distribution and not God's failure to create enough. That was the belief and the theology of the Egyptians, that had granaries only partially full but not accessible to the folk. Joseph came along and he had a different theology. He was not polytheistic, he was monotheistic. They believed that the cosmos, the heavens and the earth, was not ruled by a committee of gods for whom you have graven images and need to be fed, but that the heavens and the earth was ruled by one God, one true living God, and the earth was the Lord's, the fullness, which means abundance therein, and those that dwell therein. There was one God, which means if there's one God, that also means that there's only one common humanity. See, polytheists believe that since there's many gods, that every people have their own God. That God made you. My God made me. Your God made you. So what becomes of you is the business of your God. That's between you and your God. I bear no responsibility for you. Me and my God are going to work out what happens between us. And when people engaged in warfare, it literally was perceived to be a holy war, that the war on earth was only indicative of a war in the cosmos between two gods, and the victors on earth were only victors because their God was stronger than someone else's God. And if you lost in battle, it's only because your God was weaker than their God. And if you starved, it's not the concern of my God, that's the problem of your God. So don't bother me, because me and my God are going to worry about I, me, and my. And therefore you can go kill up and burn and destroy and commit genocide on other people whom you think in the name of your God you rid yourself of those people, because in ridding yourself of those people you rid themselves of their false God. But when you are a monotheist who believe that there is one God that rules the heavens and the earth, then that means that we are one people who are the product of one God, one common humanity, which means they are my brothers and my sisters. And at the heart of this Hebrew faith is you must love the Lord thy God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you must also love your neighbor as yourself, because they are also his people, the sheep of his pasture. Which means that when you take a Black Panther and put him in power with special powers, but also a monotheistic faith that compels him to have compassion toward others, then that means that we can no longer have temple granaries that are only partially full with grain that poor people grew, that now is going to feed rich people through the back door, and in between you feel you got to feed gods off the abundance of the land while people starve. But no, I believe, Joseph would say, that gods don't need to be fed off the abundance of the land while people starve, but God feeds people in need because he comes that we might have life and have it more abundantly. You didn't catch that. Gods don't need to be fed off the abundance of the land while people starve, but gods feed the needy so that they can have life and have it more abundantly. And so when this panther comes to power with his special powers, he then says that, Pharaoh, this is what you do. We're going to fill up the granaries to full capacity. Beyond that, we're also going to create warehouses and storehouses in the local communities. We're going to decentralize the wealth of the nation so that the people who grow it are the people who get to eat it. And we're going to push it back out into the local communities. We're going to reciprocate and recycle the wealth and decentralize and redistribute the wealth. You have before you the beginnings of a redistribution policy and the first social safety net put in place in Egypt because a Hebrew boy made it to power and had a different theology, which led to a different public policy regarding both domestic and foreign relations. He put in place a social safety net and a process of redistribution of wealth to put it back into the hands of the people in time for a great famine. But he also had a worldview that says we have to take concern for people beyond our borders. It says that when the famine hit, that the whole world was hungry. Word got out there's bread in Egypt. He stored up more than what the Egyptians needed. So folks could come to Egypt begging bread. A polytheist would have said, that's not my problem, it's you and your God's problem if you have a tribal faith. But when you have a global faith, believing one God and that we are all God's children, it says that we have to share the vibranium and its policies and purposes with the world. Because whatever we give in foreign aid is only pennies on a dollar of what we would have to pay reactionary. Because if we allow starvation to kick in because of this famine in all the earth, then wherever there's starvation, there becomes war and conflict as people are struggling for those meager resources. In that war and conflict, women and children and others flee those contexts of conflict for the sake of their lives with just the clothes on their back. And they end up in refugee camps or spilling over to the borders of other nations, which causes refugee camps become a place of conflict. It becomes where pestilence and disease breaks out. It destabilizes neighboring nations. And so as we're all tied up in a garment of mutuality, any nation of wealth and power, it should be proactive to share what they have for the stability of nations in the region. He said they can come, get bread from Egypt, and take it home, which was not anti-immigrant. It is to say most people want to stay home if home is stable. So we will use our resources in a process of distribution to stabilize the whole region, so that we then can survive and they can survive, because in the long run, we ain't gonna survive if they don't survive. They don't survive if we don't help them survive. And so he chooses to be a progressive partner in a global village, as opposed to being a isolated, protectionist, provincial, insular, isolated nation for residents and occupants who are just simply trying to hold on to entitlement and privilege at all costs. And the difference between those who want to be a progressive partner in a global village versus those who want to function as if they're in a private promised land is whether or not they function from a philosophy, a theology of scarcity or abundance. Scarcity is the belief that there ain't enough. Your conclusions are only as sound as your assumptions and your presuppositions. You remember nothing else about this sermon, remember this. If you believe that there ain't enough, that God simply hasn't produced enough, then you immediately assume that there's going to be winners and losers. Your goal then becomes to be the winner and not the loser. And that means in terms of your immigration policy, you think if we let them in, that we will become overrun. They will take our jobs because there ain't enough, real or perceived. That's one of the problems in America today. There are people who believe that the rise of historic minorities, people historically oppressed, and the arrival of others is the cause of their own economic frustrations, when in fact the data shows something very different. There's 7.5 to 8 million jobs right now unfilled in American society at all levels of the economy. We raise each year the amount of special visas to allow people from other countries to come here to do jobs that require skills that we are not producing sufficiently in American society, because there's a disconnect between our education system and the needs of our economy. Because we now live in a digital, it's service and information-based economy, but we still teach and instruct as if we're in an industrial-based economy. And therefore, even though there's 8 million jobs that need to be fed, there are people who remain unemployed and think it's, or underemployed, or wages flat. They think it's because the Mexicans got here. And it's not even the Mexicans. It's the Hondurans and Peru people and people from all the other Latin American and Central American countries who didn't come from Mexico, but through Mexico to come to the United States. And they think it's the rising of historic minorities, that the blacks and the browns and the gays are taking, and the women are taking my jobs, when the reality is, if you don't have the job you want, is because your skills don't match the needs of the economy. But because one of our two major political parties has never valued the retraining of the American workforce, we have continued to produce people with skill sets that are not needed by our emerging economy and emerging markets. But that's a theology of scarcity. There's not enough to go around. It affects our policy on voting and who has access to power and voice, because we want to win elections, even if we don't have numbers to back it, because we want to fix the elections, because we want to make decisions to make sure that our tribe comes out on top, because we think there's going to be winners and losers, and we want to be the winners. And you are only a threat to me. It comes into our mentality on trade when we think of NAFTA and pulling out of the PTT, the Pacific Trade Treaty. NAFTA was a blessing to America. Tens of millions of jobs. We gained 6 jobs for every one that we lost, and the ones we lost had to do with changes in technology. But unfortunately, people speak to the fears of folks who have a tribal faith and of folks who have a theology of scarcity, instead of telling them there's enough, and that trade is one of the reasons why we work together in alliances through trade and through national security, like through NATO and others, which is the shield against the bear in Russia, that we work together to solve our geopolitical problems without the collateral damage of war and the carnage of war, and through trade, so that we can all share in a world of abundance. But if you believe that there's not enough, that there has to be winners and losers, then in every issue you behave as if you want to make sure that your tribe is the winners and every other tribe is a threat. And you don't want to become a loser. And so now, in terms of the nation that we're going to be, you want to be a nation, if you have a theology of scarcity, you want to build walls. Keep them out, because they might come and get my stuff. You might put tariffs on steel and aluminum, to protect our jobs, even though in doing so, the cost of automobiles and everything else that uses steel and aluminum is going to go up, which is they're going to cost jobs, because those costs are going to be passed on to the consumer. It's going to cut into profits. It's going to make the stock market go down, the value of the stocks go down, and you're going to work against the economy. But if you're too ignorant to understand the connections, you might pull out of NATO and collaborative alliances. You might decide you want to come out of the Iran nuclear deal, which was a multilateral deal between at least 11 nations, not a bilateral deal between the United States and another nation. And your own Secretary of State said they are in compliance with it. Oh, but you don't like people with special powers working around you. You only want people who will tell you what you want to see. So you simply, all the panthers you get rid of, and you bring in the kittens who will simply affirm what you want to hear. What kind of nation are we going to be? Listen to the words of a man in a wheelchair, but who stood very tall historically. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who in his speech to Congress, January 11, 1944, in his Economic Bill of Rights against the backdrop of a Great Depression and a world war, he said, these are the Bill of Rights that we must ensure to all people with the confidence that there is a plenty, the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. The right to a job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. The right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. The right of every businessman, large or small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care and the opportunities to achieve and enjoy good health care. The right. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. The right to a good education. He says our own place in the world depends in large part on how fully these and similar rights are carried into practice for our citizens. That one's foreign policy only becomes an extension of one's domestic policy. Joseph fed the people of Egypt, and he fed the people of the world because he believed in becoming a progressive partner in the global village. And the question before us now is, what kind of nation are we going to be? Residents and occupants of a private promised land seeking to hold on to entitlements and privileges by any means necessary? Or are we going to become a progressive partner in the global village? Well, there was another Black Panther who had to speak to this issue. And black, somebody said that his hair was as lamb's wool, and his feet were like bronze. That's black. He spent some time as a child in Egypt as a refugee while God was taking care of a king who was trying to get rid of him. He had special powers. Started showing up when he was a kid, arguing with priests and rabbis in the temple. They showed up even better when he got later on in life and he started changing water to wine and giving sight to blind eyes and unstopping deaf ears and touching sick folks and making them whole, driving away their leprosy and their madness, and even walking on water. And every now and then he'd have a conversation with the wind and the waves and the sea and tell them, settle down, fellas, and they would just get quiet like little lambs. That's a Black Panther. He had special powers, and he said that when the nations are called before God, there's several judgments in the Bible. There's the individual judgments between the judgment seat of Christ for where the believers will go, and the great white throne judgment where the non-believers go. But it says then we're judged in our collective capacity, and the nations of history will be brought before the God of history. And it says that all the nations, if you're talking about Egypt of old, is going to be brought before God. And not ask on how beautiful were your pyramids, but who pulled the stones, and were they paid, or did did they pull him at the thread of the lash. And ancient Greece will be brought before them, and those who sat around the Parthenon, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes, who meandered while discussing the great and eternal issues of life, and the Roman Empire, the most vast of all empires, where they had the milestones where all roads led to Rome, is going to be brought before him, and the Spanish Empire with its conquistadors, who had a cross in one hand and a sword in the other, and the British Empire is going to come before him, an empire so vast that they said that the sun never set on the British Empire. And yes, even old red, white, and blue America is going to come before us. We say, God bless America. No, God's going to judge America like every other nation in history. And he says, and when you come before him, here's what I'm going to ask every single nation. This is what the Black Panther said about his father. He's going to ask every nation the same. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was a stranger in your land, did you welcome me? Was it walls or bridges? And when I was in prison, did you come visit me? Or did you just build more prisons for people like me? Did you let every valley be exalted, every hill and mountain made low? Did you make the rough places plain? Did you make the crooked places straight, so that my glory could be revealed and all flesh, since it's all mine? And of one blood did I make all the nations of the earth to be blessed, red and yellow, black and white. They're all precious in my sight. Did you share good news and bread with the world? And when all of us in our special powers ascend to prominence, whether it is the White House or your house, the schoolhouse, the courthouse, wherever God puts us, do we function from a mentality that the God who says, I can do exceedingly abundantly beyond what you can ask or imagine, that there's always enough? The only question is, do we share it? Or do we start with the assumption that there ain't enough, and therefore I got to cling to I, me, and my, and see you not as a brother, but as a threat to my privileges? How is our movie going to turn out? What do we have to share with the world? Every head bowed. Eternal and everlasting God, our Father, today we, as citizens of the wealthiest and most powerful nation on the face of the earth, who live lives of abundance, even excess, whose needs are met, and many of our wants, and yet the world is starving and sick, fragmented, fractured, broken around us. And the question becomes, what kind of nation are we going to be? And within that, God, there is a people of faith who command posts of influence, shape the idea of the nation, shape the policies of the nation, near and far. And the question becomes, what do we believe? What do we fight for? How do we see others as threats to our privileges, our entitlements, for whom our hearts wax cold and indifferent? Do we realize there is one God, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God in all, through all, and for all, for whom we are all his children, and therefore we have a duty and obligation to do what we can, not for just ourselves, but for others. We would do good to all men, because God's given enough if we would just share. So I pray, dear Lord, for the soul of this nation, the soul of the people of faith within the nation, so that our faith would open doors and not close them, lift up and not push people down, let folk in and not drive folk out. In the name of Jesus, we pray.